If you ever received a gift, or maybe you went and bought something, especially if it was an appliance, and on that box they would have these words with an arrow, this side up. Okay? You ever see one of something like that, all right? Now, why in the world do you think they put on there, this side up? Was it just to get your curiosity to see if you would turn it upside down and see what would happen? Well, usually, especially if it had to do as a refrigerator and some type of refrigeration unit or something like that, there was a specific reason for that. This side up meant that if you want this appliance or this, whatever it is, to work the way it was built to work, you've got to keep it right side up. And that will keep it functioning and doing the thing that it's supposed to do. Well, what happens when things get turned upside down in this world? Big picture is this. All of a sudden, things don't work the way God originally intended for them to work. Whether it's in individual lives, if we take God's Word and we turn it upside down, as last week as I shared some things that were happening in Rome, where we talked about the culture of Rome and all the different dynamics that were going on, the sexual immorality and the attitude towards life and all of that. It was interesting at both services, after I read that list, they both said, we're living in that day. That is us today. What Paul was addressing to the Roman church in 58 AD when he wrote this letter are also exactly the same conditions that we face today. And we said we can learn something today for our lives from what Paul said many years ago. And I will continue with that thought. Yes, we can. See, last week, the end of the sermon dealt with the first part of Romans chapter 2, and it had to do with God's judgment. And God, in that passage, basically tells the Jews, said, don't think too highly of yourselves. God is going to judge all people. Today we're going to continue that in chapter 2, verses 11 through the end of the chapter. And I'm not going to deal with this specifically, but it's all a part of it. We need to get the big picture. The umbrella message of this chapter is this: God will bring judgment on His people. And we all fall under that umbrella of judgment. And how we live our lives will make a difference how that turns out in the end. So if we are living in this world and the world is turned upside down, and what was once considered wrong is now considered right, and what is considered right is now considered wrong, is it any wonder we have a lot of confusion in lives today? So how do you live right side up in an upside down world? From Romans chapter 2, verses 11 through 29, I want to share 4 thoughts today. If you need the Bible, I'm not going to be reading all the verses, but I would encourage you to grab that pew Bible there in front of you and turn to page 131 is where we'll begin, or open your own Bible. And let's see what Paul today has to say to us that might help us to realize what it's going to take for us to live right side up in a world that seemingly is living upside down. First, we need to live humbly before God. Listen to what Paul says in verses 11 and 12. For God does not show favoritism. All who sin apart from the law will also perish apart from the law, and all who sin under the law will be judged by the law. Now, it's possible that there were questions in the early church there. The Roman church was made up of Gentiles who had not known the Jewish law. They had not known God's law. And it was made up of Jews who were raised with the Jewish law. And it's possible that the Gentiles were saying this: well, how can God judge me? I never heard His word. I never heard His law. How is it that I could be judged by that law? And some of the Jews were saying, well, hey, we are privileged. We have received God's law. And because He gave it to us, we are His special people and we're in good with God. We don't have anything to worry about. And what does Paul tell them? He says, you're both wrong. He says, God shows no favoritism. You will all be judged, and God's judgment will be fair. So how do you live upright in an upside-down world? And when it comes to judgment, have you ever found yourself thinking, well, judgment, yeah, that's for all the bad people, all right? They're the ones that are going to be standing before God. But next week we'll look at Romans chapter 3, and there's a verse in there you've probably heard before, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We'll unpack that a little bit more next week, but just suffice it to say, here God won't show favoritism. We're all in this together. We're in the same boat. We'll all stand before God. And it's how we stand, not just on that day of judgment, but also how we stand today before God that will make a difference. I think if there's anything that we need to grasp when we think about standing before God, we've got to be humble. We've got to live humbly before God. That's not always an easy thing. We like kind of being up front. We like feeling good about ourselves. Humility is not a characteristic that is promoted in our culture today. But it's something that's found a lot in the Bible. Matthew chapter 16 is an interesting chapter. Jesus has been out preaching, teaching for a while, and he gathers his disciples one day in front of him and says, hey guys, just tell me, what are the people out there saying about me? Who are they saying that I am? And the disciples will say, well, some say you're John the Baptist. And others say you're Elijah or Jeremiah or one of the prophets. They were saying that you've come back to life as one of those great prophets. And then Jesus said, well, who do you say that I am? To his disciples, the 12, the ones that had been there when he had walked on water and fed the 5,000, all these things. And Peter steps up and shines bright and says, you are the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And I could see Jesus come over giving a high five. We don't think of Jesus doing things like that. But just imagine, good job, Peter. You've got it right. And because of what you just said, Peter, I'm going to give you the keys to the kingdom. And upon the fact that you declare that I am the Christ, the Messiah, the Lord, you're going to receive the keys to the kingdom. Peter had to be feeling pretty good about himself about then. But then the next verse says, and then from that point on, Jesus went and began to tell them all the things that must happen to him as he was going to go into Jerusalem. He told about his death, about his crucifixion, about his arrest. And you can just imagine the surprise of the disciples as they were hearing this. And then Peter, once again, being the bold one in the group, the text says that he took Jesus aside. He says, come here, Jesus, we need to talk. So they walked over there and said, Lord, that's never going to happen to you. He was kind of saying, I'm not going to let that happen. And then Jesus says to Peter, get thee behind me, Satan. Talk about going from the penthouse to the outhouse. Peter was humbled by the words of Jesus. Because he went from being the rock of the church to the stumbling block for the church. Humility is one of those things that sometimes we learn the hard way in life. There's a story told of the great coach Vince Lombardi from the Green Bay Packers. Maybe you've heard of him. Maybe some of you are fans of him. And he became so accustomed to any time he was in public that people would come up and they'd want his autograph. So the story is told that one day he's in a restaurant there and he's sitting there eating and he sees this little boy coming from across the restaurant over to him, and he immediately grabs the menu there and autographs it for him, and the little boy comes up to the table and he hands him the menu, and the little boy says, no sir, I don't need your menu, all I want is your ketchup. You know. Little boy had no clue who Vince Lombardi was, and that may have been a humbling moment for him. You know, sometimes we're kind of like Vince Lombardi. We get to the point that, well, everybody's looking to me and everybody's expecting me of this and everybody, you know, and I'm just going to be the person on the spot all the time. But living right side up in an upside down world means we need to live humbly before God. The Jews had got the idea that they'd been given the law. And that meant they were okay. And the Gentiles said, well, we don't have the law to judge us, so that means we're okay. And Paul says, God shows no favoritism. We all need to be ready to stand before Him. And it'll be a lot more comfortable standing before Him if we can learn right now to live a life humbly before Him. Second thing in this chapter down in verse 13 is this. Not only are we to live humbly before God, but we need to not just hear, we need to do. Don't just hear, do. Look at verse 13. For it is not those who hear the law who are righteous in God's sight, but it is those who obey the law who will be declared righteous. Now, without reading the whole section here, Paul goes on to the argument of saying that men will be judged by their own conscience. Even if they didn't have the law, it's how they lived which God will judge them from. And many times, Paul addresses this issue of the law in his writings. One thing we need to understand, the Jewish law had been the standard for thousands of years. For thousands of years, that's what the Jews lived by. And Paul goes on later in Romans and in some of these books, the book of Galatians and others, and basically says the law by itself is not bad. It's not bad that God gave us a law. It lets us know what is right and wrong. He says the problem comes in when you begin to make the law a checklist of righteousness, and if you go down there and say, check, 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 okay, I'm in good, that's when it becomes a problem. And that's what had happened in the Jewish culture, and that had bled over into the church as the Jews that were there trying to still teach that. You've got to do this. You've got to do that. You can't eat this. You've got to eat that. You can't go here. You got to go there. You got all these things. And Paul just reminds them, no. Because they wanted to go a little bit deeper. It was the motivation for following the law that made the difference. We need to ask ourselves the question, am I following God's law because I want God to love me and I'll get something good out of it in the end? Or are we obeying God because we love Him and then that causes us to do what is good? Does that make sense? Think about it. I'll give you this illustration. The staff is reading a book called The Prodigal God by John Piper. He gives an illustration in that book. It's a parable. It's not found in the Bible, okay? But he makes up a story. He says one day Jesus and the disciples were walking along. It was the morning. And Jesus turned to his disciples and said, all right, guys, I want you all to pick up a rock. So they all picked up a rock. And Peter picked up the smallest rock he could find. That way he could kind of put it in his cloak there and not be burdened with it. So they all got the rock and they continued on. And about noontime, Jesus stopped, gathered around the disciples. Said, all right, that rock that you're carrying, hold out your hand with that rock. And then Jesus, poof, turned the rock to bread. He says, okay, time for lunch. And what they had to eat was the size, whatever it was, of rock they had. Peter was pretty disappointed. He wasn't very satisfied because he had gotten a very small rock. And he had a very small lunch that day. And then as they were getting ready to continue on the journey, Jesus says, okay guys, pick up another rock. Now Peter, he was pretty sharp because he thought, man, if that was lunch, the next one must be supper. All right? So he goes and finds this biggest rock he can carry. And they're carrying it for 2 or 3 hours, and all the up and down over the hills. And it's really a burden to him. And finally, they come up to the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus calls all the guys over to the Sea of Galilee. And he says to the disciples, all right, guys, throw your rock in the sea. And they threw the rock in the sea. And then he turned and he just continued to walk. And Peter was like, wait a minute. What was that all about? And Jesus turned to him and said, Peter, were you carrying that rock for me or yourself? You see, Peter carried both rocks for himself. The first, because he didn't want to be burdened. And the second, because he wanted to receive a large reward because of the burden he was carrying. Peter received what self-serving brings: emptiness and burdens. Our reason for living right side up makes all the difference. And the reason we're doing it makes all the difference. Are you living so that God will reward you? Are you living because you love God? And because of that, you will receive His rewards. The book of James says it like this. James 1, 22 through 25. Don't merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like a man who looks at his face in the mirror and after looking at himself goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. But the man who looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues to do this, not forgetting what he has heard, but doing it, will be blessed in what he does. To live right side up in an upside down world, we need to do rather than just hear. And we need to do it for the right reasons. In the next section, Paul enters into a large section in verses 17 through 24. And I summarized it up basically like this: practice what you preach. I'm going to read that whole section. It's not all on the screen. I kind of put the first verse and the last verses there. But in the middle, there's some things that we all need to hear because it helps us understand a little bit better. He says, now you, if you call yourself a Jew, if you rely on the law and brag about your relationship to God, there's that, I'm a Jew, I'm special, look what I've received. If you rely on the law and brag about your relationship with God, if you know His will and approve what is superior because you're instructed by the law, if you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in dark, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of infants, because you have the law of the embodiment of knowledge and truth. You then, who teach others, do you not teach yourself? It's a rhetorical question. What are you teaching all this? Aren't you listening to what you're having to say? You who preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that people should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who brag about the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? As it is written, God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Complete this sentence. Actions speak. Oh, okay. So you do know that. All right. We all know that. We've heard that. And we know that. Actions speak louder than words. I keyed in on the last verse, the last phrase of that verse, where it says, God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Paul is saying to all the Christians there, if you go around and you put on this good air, if you say these things and you teach these things and you tell other people how to do these things, but you're not doing it yourself, then God is blasphemed. That is a pretty strong statement. Today we call that hypocrisy. And it's maybe one of the toughest things that the church has to deal with. It might be one of the things that has caused more people to say, I don't want anybody to be any part of that. If that's what the church is about, then I don't want to have anything to do with that. You know, I love the church, and I believe it's the only hope for the world. We're having an election coming up in a couple of weeks. Probably, if you haven't noticed, it's out there. There's going to be a lot of people depending on their party or their candidate to change things and make things right. You know what? I don't think either one of them is going to change things or make things right. It's only the power of the gospel changing lives that can make things right. And that's what we need to be praying for. That God may use our leaders to do that. In fact, the Sunday before the election, My sermon's on Romans 13, and the title of the sermon is going to be God's Plan for Politicians. You'll want to come and hear that one, all right? But we must behave in a way in our lives so that the church and God is never defamed. That means we need to live consistent Christian lives, not just on Sunday and around people that go to church, but on Monday through Saturday, wherever we find ourselves, be it in the workplace or the grocery store or the bank, or even driving down Tamiami. That may be the biggest challenge. Paul just says we need to live upright lives and we need to practice what we preach, because if we don't, God Himself will be blasphemed. Now, that's a pretty strong statement. One final thing, verses 28 and 29. To live upright, or right side up in an upside down world, we must live for praise from men, right? No. We must live for praise from God. Verses 28 and 29. A man is not a Jew if he is only one outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a man is a Jew if he is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart by the Spirit, not by the written code. It makes all the difference what we believe, and it makes all the difference of how we live. Such a man's praise is not from men, but from God. Living for God is not an outward or external thing. It's something that needs to come from the inside. And the Jews for years had lived on this external deal. Yeah, that checklist I told you about. If I just do this, and I fill out the checklist, then I'm in good shape. But Paul is saying, no, it has to come from the inside out. They relied on all kinds of rituals. He mentions the Jewish rite of circumcision that went back all the way to the days of Abraham. It had been around for 1,000 years. And for them, that was their sign that says, yeah, that means I'm one of God's special chosen people. And they came up with all these things outwardly that they were to do. Paul says, no, it has to go much deeper than that. Some of those things got to reflect an inward change. For over 36 years, over 36 years ago, Judy and I exchanged wedding rings. June 7th, 1980 was our wedding day. I'm really glad I picked an even number like 80 because it makes it a lot easier to figure out how long you've been married. You know, let's see. All right, 0. All right, I can 36 years. Well, that day we exchanged rings, and you have done it. You've seen it done, maybe in a ceremony. These rings are but a symbol of the love which you have, and this is the lines I use, of the love which you have in your heart. They're made in perfect circles, symbolizing that your love must have no beginning or end. May your love continue as these rings symbolize. Now, over 36 years, Judy and I, maybe once or twice, have disagreed on something. All right. Now, when that happens, I don't rub my ring for good luck. All right. All right, ring, come on, you can do it. All right. In fact, after about 5 years ago, we had a fire in our house and had a lot of smoke damage, had a fire in the garage, and everything in our house was completely taken out. They removed everything. Well, in that whole process, my wedding ring was lost. Now, the day we discovered my wedding ring was lost, we didn't say, well, the ring's gone, we're out of here. We're done. You know, I'll go on, you live your life. No. Why? Because our love didn't rest in the ring. It was merely a symbol of our love. And what if I tried to make this ring more than what it was? What if I decided to be maybe abusive to her or unfaithful to her, and I started to not care for her or care for the family anymore? And she finally had it, and she said, look, you're out of here. I don't want you to be my husband any longer. And what if I responded, wait a minute, you can't do that. I've wore this ring for 36 years. I may have mistreated you and been unfaithful to you and been abusive to you, but I wore your ring. Do you think she would respond and say, oh, you're right, I'm sorry. You've worn the ring, what a tremendous sacrifice, all's right. That probably wouldn't be her response. Why? Because love is much more than this piece of metal. And commitment is much more than just this piece of metal. If I just depended on this hunk of metal to do everything that needed to be done, it wouldn't be a marriage. Well, Paul is telling us it's the things in our life that come from the inside out. In our relationship with God, that's what makes it real. And that's what makes it strong. And to live right side up in an upside down world means more than just going through the motions for God and hoping that if I do enough good things, He's going to say, you're in. It means humbling ourselves before Him and realizing that my very life from the inside out is what makes a difference for eternity. So it's my prayer that all of us here today aren't just going through the motions, but that we are truly living right side up in an upside down world, because at the heart and the core of everything is our love for God, and we want to please Him. Let's pray.